in terms of, you know, the end of the year, beginning of the year Israeli assault on Gaza in particular, you know, while the administrations are shifting in Washington, and there's been some criticism of sort of the silence of the Obama folks before, you know, coming into office. And then just reading the sort of the findings of the Goldstone report in terms of, you know, what their assessment is of what was happening. You know, what bearing does that have in terms of, again, the importance of the U.S. trying to take some clear and strong positions on Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, particularly how the rest of the world is seeing it, because it seems like the rest of the world assesses it much differently than we do.
They do. Everybody else in the world, I think, is a lot better informed than we are. I have to be very blunt. The media do a terrible job of keeping the American people informed about the world. They do an appallingly bad job. You go anywhere else in the world and they know more about what's going on in the United States and in the rest of the world than the best informed Americans do. People who read the newspapers and see cable news and have access to whatever in this country are not as well informed as the ordinary citizen in France or Lebanon or wherever you go, India. The media do a terrible job, generally. So we're not very well informed, and people do have a different view of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Most of what most people think in this country is falsehood and myth about that issue. I mean, they don't really know a great deal, and they have a few assumptions that are tied to very strongly held ideas. Terrorism. Well, terrorism is a big issue, but there's all kinds of layers there that you have to look at if you want to understand where it's coming from and what to do about it. The Israeli approach is, this is a hammer and this is a nail, and we have a hammer and we just bash it and bash it and bash it. And the more force you apply, the more successful you'll be. Well, I hate to say it, but somebody should look at the results over many, many decades. It doesn't seem to have worked. Well, that's because it's not a nail, and the only means of dealing with it is not force. There are multiple issues involved. And so that's one thing that I think we have to really think very, very, very carefully about. The second thing is, there are a couple of levels of this problem that have history behind them. I mean, the occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Jerusalem in 1967, 42 odd years now. The issues that go back to 1948, the refugee problem. These are root causes of everything. You can take whatever position you want on them, but you have to go back and look at those things if you want to resolve the problem. You can't say, okay, this is where we are and we start from the status quo. Well, you start from the status quo, you're going to end up with the status quo. You start with how we got to the status quo and how we might rejigger things so that we have a better situation, a better outcome. Then you might have well, you will have a different result. So I think there are a lot of problems in the way that public opinion and politicians in this country address this issue.
Well, maybe just by way of wrapping up, and you already kind of alluded to I guess the question I was asking in terms of, again, coming back to your most recent book. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that is important about reading history is that obviously if we try to learn from those lessons, and, you know, what would you say are some of the things that we need to, you know, both as citizens of this country, but also when we engage our politicians, what lessons should we learn from that sort of Cold War era as it relates to what's going on in the Middle East now?
Well, there's a whole lot of lessons, just a couple. One would be you have to pay attention to history. And you have to understand that even if we're a little bit amnesiac, other people in the world are not. So, you know, you talk to the average American, you say Musaddaq, 1953. They won't have any idea what you're talking about. There's not an Iranian, no matter how old or young, who doesn't remember that the United States overthrew the last constitutional, freely elected parliamentary government in Iran and installed a dictatorship. There's not an Iranian who doesn't know it. It's seared into their memory. It's like 1776 for us. It's like the Civil War for us. It's just something that to them is a central fact of their history. Well, it doesn't mean we have to be obsessed with it like the Iranians are, but if you don't even pay attention to that, you don't know what you're doing. You're blind and you're dumb. And our policies, unfortunately, and I don't want to say our policies, but the way we look at some of these issues just doesn't take account of the importance of history. Sometimes we do pay attention to history. As far as the Israelis are concerned, they're obsessed with not just Israeli history, Jewish history, the Holocaust, and the whole history that goes back, in their case, thousands of years. But we don't pay attention to the fact that everybody has their history, and they're all obsessed with history. This is a particularly history-soaked part of the world. Something here that goes back to the 1830s is very, very old. something there that goes back to the 1130s is not that old. Something there that's 2,000 years old. My daughter's an archaeologist. She works on civilizations, big cities that are 7,000 or 6,000 years old. That's old there. So they have a different time scale than we do. And we have to respect that. I mean, we're not going to become Middle Easterners and they're not going to become Americans, but you have to understand that that's the way they think, and not just the Israelis, not just the Iranians, everybody. So that's that's I think an important lesson. And the recent history is particularly important. The ancient history is often mythologized and turned into justifications for stuff. But the recent history you do really have to pay attention to. And you know, we did some successful things in the Middle East during the Cold War, and we did some less successful things. One of the less successful things we did was to fail to foster democracy. The United States, and certainly the Soviet Union, did nothing to foster democracy. In the case of the Soviets, it's understandable, dictatorship. But the United States, which is a democracy and which favors democracies generally, and did favor democracies in places like Europe and East Asia, did really nothing to foster democracy in the Middle East for the whole span of the Cold War. I mean, there are a couple of countries that are democracies, and not due to the United States. Israel's a democracy. Turkey has become a democracy. I don't think we can say this is to our credit. But I think that the fact that there is such a black hole as far as democracy and governance that's acceptable to the people of those countries has a lot to do with the way in which we did not make that a priority, and nor did the Soviets during the Cold War. And I think that we should pay more attention to that. Now, the Bush administration, to their credit, talked this up. I don't think they did very much. I would like to see that as an important consideration. Now, you can't force it on people. Democracy does not grow out of the barrel of a gun. You can't march into a country, overthrow their government, and impose democracy. But I think it is something that we should try and foster.
Okay, right. Well, Professor Khalidi, thank you very much for speaking with us this morning.
Pleasure.